In this video, I'm going to show how to create functional pickups. The first pickup is a pickup that will give the character a player ability, in this case a jump boost, and the second pickup will enable the player to unlock a door. So the first thing we need to do is to actually have some actors in the scene. So I've got a model for my keycard, and what I need to do is add an actor into the scene that will provide the pickup, the visual for the pickup, and also will provide the basis for the blueprint. So let's go and make a blueprint class. Let's make this an actor, and let's call this pickup underscore BP. And if I double click and open this up, the visual component for this is going to be a static mesh. So I'm going to add a component, static mesh, and I'm going to call this key, because I know this is going to be a key. And I'm going to search for my key card, and there's my static mesh. So my pivot for my key card is actually kind of on this handle device. But I'm actually going to move it slightly off to the side because I'm going to use a rotator just to animate in the actual scene. And then the next thing I want to do is I want a mechanism where I can generate an event when the player gets too close to it, and that would be a sphere collision. So I'm going to search for a sphere collision, and I'm probably going to crank that up to about half a meter, and compile that. Oh, and I want to add my rotator, so rotating movement. So this would just cause the whole thing to spin, and I'm going to compile that and minimize it, and now I have my pickup, and I'm just going to plot this in the scene. So we can see there's the mesh, we can see there's the collision, and if I hit play, we can see that our pickup is definitely rotating around, and then I can approach the pickup. And as you can see, at the moment, nothing happens. So I want to generate an event when the player is sufficiently close to this pickup. Let's open this up again. And then we need to think strategically about the order of events and what kind of events that we want to happen. So if I click on the event graph, we get our standard nodes, which we don't need. So I'm just going to delete them. And we have a sphere collision, and we can look for an event from the sphere collision. And in this case, we want the begin component overlap. So when we overlap the sphere collision, something will happen. And we want to first of all find out whether the other actor is the player. And same as we did with the door, this will be looking for the third person. And we want to cast to the third person character blueprint in our case. And if you're using first person character, you'll want to cast to the first person character. Okay, so provided we know that it's actually a character, not an enemy or a box or something else, we want to do something. And what we need to do is basically send a message to the player that they've picked up an item. And that could be as simple as sending a string message to the player, or sending a number to the player. The best solution is something called an enum, which is basically an annotated list. And that list gets converted into numbers. So the computer is only dealing with numbers, but we get something a little bit more readable. So we could send strings. We could have things called keycard blue and keycard red. The problem with strings is that if you mistype the string, then the system's not going to work. And if you want to change the name of the string, you're going to have to change a lot of strings in your code. And the problem with a number is the fact that you have to have a big table somewhere that says item number 3 is blue keycard and item number 4 is the red keycard. And enum provides us kind of a nice compromise between those things. So we want to send a message to the player, and the player will basically be embedded as a function, or in other words, the way that we would do that would be as a function. So we need our player. Let's go and open up our third-person character blueprint, and so we already have our a couple of functions for health. We are going to add a new function, and this function is basically going to be receive pickup. I will put a capital P. Right. So we can call a function to say receive the pickup, and then this function will do the appropriate thing depending on the pickup. And so the last thing we need to do is generate this pickup list, this e-number list. So I need this list of pickups, and the way I'm going to generate that is I'm going to right click, I'm going to go to blueprints, and I'm going to open up something called an enumeration, and it says an enumeration is a list of named values. So I'm going to click on this, and I'm going to call this pickup list. And I'm going to double click on this. Here's my description of this. So all pick up items. And then I'm going to add my basically my list of items. So the first one is going to be the jump boost, and my next one is going to be the door key. And you can add lots and lots of different items. Okay, let's just save that. So I have this thing called a pickup list. Let's go back to our blueprints. And I want to go, I want to be going to our third person blueprint. So this receive pickup, its input should be one of the enumerators from our list. So if we look at our blueprint example, we have a pickup list. So we want to add an input. And this type of input wants to be an enum. And there is a lot of enum, but down the bottom is our pickup list. We could also search for our pickup list. So this is our item picked, and it will expect it to be something in that list. And then all I'm going to do is do a print. And I'm going to convert this from the enum into a string so that we can print it out and check that things are working. So we have this function called receive pickup, and so I should be able to access this function from the third person character blueprint. So if I search for rec pickup, we can see that we can call this function, and it basically now will give me a list of the items that we can pick up. So in this instance, we do want to pick up the jump boost. So I'm going to compile this. And the other thing that we want to do is, because we don't want the player to keep picking up the item, is we want to basically get rid of it from the scene, from the level. And in this instance, we're going to destroy the actor. And that will get rid of it. So let's just test this out. So what should happen is the player should be able to walk up. It will cause an on-collision overlap event. We check to make sure it's a player. If it's a player, we call the function for the player. That function sends the item from the list, and that item will be jump boost. And then once it's sent it and called that function, we will destroy the actor. And then on the receiving end, when this function is called, we're just going to print out. So let's play this. So here's my character. Here's the pickup. When I get close to the pickup, we get jump boost appear on the screen and the pickup disappears. Okay, so now all I need to do is implement the jump boost. So let's go back and look at our blueprints. So this is complete. And this basically just needs to figure out what item I picked up and do the appropriate action. So what we want to do is, when this function is called, we want to know which item is picked up, and then we need to make the appropriate decision depending. So if we drag off the item and look for a switch, then we can switch on the pickup list. And what this will do is it will take up the item picked up, whatever is the input, and then it will give us executables depending on what we've picked up. So if we picked up the jump boost, we want to do something. And in our instance, what we want to do is we want to change a value in the character movement. So if I drag in the character movement, and we want to alter the jump, and specifically we want to set the jump Z velocity. So if I just have a quick look for jump Z, we can see our jump Z velocity at the moment is 300. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to set this jump velocity to maybe something like, let's go for 700. And what this should do is it should enable me to jump higher after I've collected the pickup. So let's go and see what happens. So here's my initial jump value. And if I go and click the pickup, we don't get a message on the screen because I've removed it, but now we get a much higher jump. Okay, so that's one type of pickup successfully working. So the next step is to change this pickup so that it is actually a door key instead. And in this instance, what we need to do is first we need to be able to lock the door. And that means that we're going to need some kind of inventory system so that we can check whether or not the character is carrying the right inventory item. And again, it makes sense to use the same enum list, the same pickup system. So in this case, when we walk up to the door, it already opens. What we'd like to do is first of all find out whether the player is carrying the correct item. Okay, so let's open up the editor for the door. And what we need to do here is we need to ask the player if they have the right item. And so one of the things we need to do with the door is have a variable that stores the correct item. So let's add a variable. Let's set the variable to be key required. There we go. And again, this is going to be our pickup. Right, and I'm just going to compile that, and then the key required is actually going to be the door key. We could add other items to this, and one of the interesting items we could add is a null. Is an item that basically says we don't require a door key. Put this in. So we need to get this item. What we need to do is find out if the player has that item. So we need to call a function. The player needs to have that function, and then that player function needs to tell us whether or not we have that item. So we need a new function, and it's quite important to always, when you've got multiple actors and multiple objects, to break things up into functions. We could access the data inside the character itself. So if we look at the doorway blueprint, there is a whole load of information that we can access when it comes to this particular character. So we can access the variables of this character. We have the pawn system, we have the rendering system. We could fiddle with all of these variables, but it's not really considered good practice to do that. It's much better to call a function and let the other actor deal with the request. Right, okay, so we need a new function called request item from inventory. It's quite wordy, but it does kind of sum up what it is that we want. So what we want is we want to know whether or not the player is carrying this. So the input, we need an input for this, and that is going to be something from the pickup list. So that's going to be the item required, and the output is going to be a simple yes or no. Do you have this item? Yes or no. And in this case, we want to return a Boolean, which is going to be the player has item. We can call this function. Let's go back to our doorway. So we can look at the key required. We can now call our request item from inventory. We can ask if you have the requested item. And then we now can use this as an if statement. So this is the if. If this is true, we play. And again, let's just go back to this and let's just set this to true. So we're always going to return true to this. So that shouldn't affect the operation of the door. And let's test. So if I go up to the door, it should open. And it does. Excellent. If I open up my door print again, this is all pretty much working. I don't really have to do anything else with this. Let's test our third person by returning always false. Let's compile and play. So now when I run up to this, it doesn't, because the player is always saying I don't have that item. So now we need an inventory system. We need a way in which the player can hold an array of items. We need an inventory system inside the player. So we have our third person character blueprint. We want to add a variable, and this is going to be the player inventory. This is going to be our pickup list, but it isn't going to be a single item. It's going to be an array of items. In other words, the player might be holding multiple objects. Okay, so we now have an array of things that the player can hold. And I am going to drag and drop this in, and we are going to do a get player inventory. And what we need to do is we need to find out whether the required item is in the player's inventory. So in order to do this, I'm going to drag off this node, and I am going to search for contains item. And basically I want to say, does the item required, is it in the player's inventory? So is this item required, is it contained inside the player's inventory? And I can just pipe that straight out to our return node. So before I test this out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to enable this as a public variable. So that will mean it will be visible in the editor. Right, let's shift this over. Let's go in and play. And if I go up to the door, it's not in the player's inventory. So Alt-Tab, I need to select our third person character blueprint, and I need to come down to the default, and we can see there is a player inventory array with no elements in it. So I'm going to add an element, and I'm going to add the door key. And then I'm going to walk up to the door, and now the door opens because I'm carrying the door key. Okay, let's just change this to the jump boost. So I've picked up the jump boost, but let's see if that will open the door. And it does not. And then again, I'm going to switch back, make sure that they've got the door key, and then that enables that. So now all we need to do is to change this function of this actor. So rather than this actor being enabling the jump boost, we want it to actually be a pickup, which provides the player with an item to the inventory. So here's our pickup code, and in this case we had it checking for the, or rather it was a jump boost item. What we need to do in this case is we need to get rid of this, and we instead need to call a function to add an item to the player's inventory. So again, we don't have that function, so we need to go back and add a function. This function is going to be add to player inventory. And there will need to be an input. And that input will again be from our list. And I'm going to set item picked up. So we have the item picked up. And then we need to add this item to the player inventory. So I'm going to get this, and I want to add. And I'm going to use the add unique function. And what the add unique function does is, if there were multiple keys in the level, because you wanted to make it the game easier, then you wouldn't want to keep adding the same item to the array, because the array would grow, but all the items would be identical. So in this case, we're going to add unique, which means that if it checks to see if that item is already in the list, and if it is already, then it won't add that item to the list. So the item picked up is added into the player's inventory. And that's all that function does. So we can go back to our pickup, and then we can call this function add to player inventory. And in this case, we want to add the door key. And then once we've done it, we want to destroy it. Okay, so now I should have a completely functioning inventory system. So here's the player, and they run up to the door and it doesn't work. They come up here and they collect the item and it disappears, and they run up to the door and the door opens. So the last thing which would be nice to add would be a way of enabling the player to see that they have the key card. So we already have a HUD, and one of the things that we'd like to do is to add the key card so somewhere on the HUD, so that the player knows that they've already got this key card. And to do that, I'm just going to be using basically a very simple image. So I want to add an image. Let's just plop this down here. And if you go into the appearance section, there is something called brush, and there is a slot for the image. So here's my keycard image, and I can just drag and drop that in, and there is the image. And I'm going to call this keycard. So there's my keycard image. And by the default, you can see that this is going to be displayed. Let's just compile this. Let's play. And you can see that the keycard is now on the HUD. But we don't really want the keycard to be there until the player has picked up that particular item. So if we come back here, what we want is a way of enabling whether or not this is displayed. We need to look at whether we can change the visibility of this image. And if we scroll down, we can see that it says something called behavior, and we can see that we've got this thing called visible. And we can set this to be hidden. So in other words, when we compile and play, we can see that it does not appear. And what we want to happen is when we collect the key card, we want it to then appear. So the functionality for this will be in our third person blueprint. And when we add an item to the player's inventory, we want to check to see if that item is, in this case, the key card, and then we want to display that on the HUD. So we need to take this, and again we need to do our switch function, and I will connect this up. And then we need to detect whether it's the door key. And if it is the door key, we need to change something in the HUD. So I'm going to drag our HUD reference in. And then I am going to look for our key card. I'm going to get our key card. And then I'm going to look for the set visibility. So when this function is called, we take the pickup item, we add it to the list of things that the player is carrying, and then we check to see whether it's a door key, and if it's a door key, we set the item visible on the HUD. Okay, so let's just check this again. We don't have a door key, we can't open the door. We pick up the door key, the HUD item becomes active, and then we go through the door. So as an exercise, one of the things that you might want to consider is removing an item from the list when the player goes through the door. And remember, if you remove an item from the list, you also need to check to see whether that item has a display in the HUD. And then if it has a display in the HUD, you also need to remove or hide that display item. Okay, so that is how we would do pickups